Alright, so let's look at some examples that we went over in class today and just kind of review everything that we've talked about. The first thing that we talked about was if you've got a string, or actually if you've got several strings, you can merge them together, and that would be using the plus symbol. So let's say we have test, and then we have another variable that is another string. We can pull those together and we'll just output it to the console here. That's some var plus, and we're saying that with the plus that now we're appending some information to it. So if we turn on the console here and run it, it's going to merge both of those together. And we also said we can, statically, without assigning a variable, we can just actually put a little bit of information in, or put a string in between. And so when we run it, we've actually appended 3 strings together. So we applied the string that was in some var, then we appended that with a string that just had a blank space in it, and then appended a variable called some other var that had another string in it. Okay, and then we also talked about if we had a variable that was a number, let's say some number equals 10, that in that case, if we use the plus, then it's actually going to do a math operation and add that together to get 15. Okay, then we also demonstrated the difference between a string and a number just by saying, okay, let's say we have a string that has a number in it. It's still a string. It's still a list of characters basically, and we look at it as that, not as a number. So if we were to come in and try to add those two together, even though they at some var plus some other var, even though these look like numbers, since they're in quotes, they're actually strings. And so when we run it, it's actually just appending the 5 to the 10 instead of running a math operation like the previous example did. Okay. Now the next thing that we talked about was a variable type of array, and we said we can have a variable that contains a list of values in it. Okay, so we used an example in class of everybody's names, and we separate all these with a comma, and of course enclose them in quotes. Okay, so this gives us a list with about 7 items in it, and we said that in that array we could use console.log names and then use the index of that list item. Let me comment this out. List item to reference it. So if I run with JS, it's going to give me doc, because this is the first one in there. And so remember that we said that when you're working with an array, you start counting from 0. Everything in programming counts from 0. And so we'd say that this has an index of 0, this has an index of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Alright. So that would be how we reference an item in an array. Comment that out, and then we're going to look at how we can operate, how we can go through each one of these items in an array and do something with it. And we said that that was with a for loop. Okay, and we said that they're just like functions and if-else statements. We have something that wraps around a block of code and does that block of code is only executed if a certain condition is met. Okay, and so we said that the for loop has basically three parts to it. We have a starting value, and so we might say something like I equals 0. And then we have a condition, and we say, okay, the code inside of these curly brackets are going to be executed over and over and over as long as this condition is true. Okay, and we looked at conditions with if-else statements. We're doing the exact same thing here with this condition. So we might say as long as I is less than or equal to 6, then this loop is going to keep running over and over and over. So if we say that I equals 0 is where we start, and our condition is I is less than or equal to 6, it means it's going to run, then we have to say how I changes every time that loop is run. So our third argument, or part of this condition, is to say how we change I every single time that this loop runs. So we can say I, if we wanted to increase by 1 every time, we could say I equals I plus 1. Okay, so every time this runs, this is going to be executed. So the first time it runs, I is going to equal 0. The next time it runs, I is going to equal 1. The next time it runs, I is going to equal 2. It's going to keep doing that until it's greater excuse me, until it's greater than 6. So when I equals 7, then it's going to stop running. It's going to keep going, executing any code that's after that for loop. Okay. And then we said inside of a loop we can still use the I, and so what we'll do is use it inside there to reference the part of the array that we're trying to get to, or that item in the array. So let's set up an example here. We said we want to, in our HTML, we're going to set up a div id equals result. Alright, just an empty div, has an ID of result on it, and we're going to take all of these items and insert them into that div. Okay, and so we said probably the easiest way to do it would be to just create a blank string, and then inside the loop we're going to say, okay, just go ahead and add a value to that, or append it, just like we were talking about appending values. Now a shortcut we could do, we could come in and say, okay, let's start with result every time, and then add, we'll say result plus whatever our value we want, which we'll get to that in a second, would be, and that would work, but it's kind of a long way to put it. And so we said there's a shortcut of plus equals value, and that's saying take this and append it to whatever is the current value of result. So as this runs, it's going to keep adding whatever this is to the end of it. Alright, so if we were to say, just to show what's going to happen inside, we're going to say console.log result, and when we run it, we're going to see that it added value several times through there, over and over and over, just append it to the end. Okay, well, that's kind of boring, doesn't actually use anything from our list, but that at least shows how we're going to gather all that information from the array into one place, so that we can, when we get done, we can insert that into our div tag that we just created. So in this case, we're appending to the result, and we say, let's use names and brackets, okay, because we want to reference it, but we use the I instead of actually saying, okay, name 0 or name 1 or something like that. We say name I. So the first time this runs, that's going to be the same thing as saying name 0. The next time it runs, it increases by 1, so that's going to be the same thing as saying name 1. And so it's going to loop through and grab each one of these values and append it to the result. So if we run this again, we're going to see that that's not working at all like we want, because I misnamed the variable. So let's try that again. Alright, so now you see that we're getting what we expect. As we ran through that loop over and over, it adds the name that it pulled from the names array, and appended it to everything that was previously there. So each time that for loop ran, it added another name to it as it hit that array. Okay, and then we said this is all nice and wonderful, but what if we don't know how many items are in an array? How can we make it a little bit easier to just automatically say run through all the items that are in this array and then stop? Okay, and so we talked about the fact that let me put that back in there so it doesn't error out, that in previous times we said with a string we had a property called length. Okay, so if we said come up here and change this to some test string, and then we did console.log some var.length, and we'll comment this out so it doesn't confuse anything. When we run it, it's going to give us a number, and that's how many characters are in this string. So we also have a length property on an array, but instead of giving us a number of characters in an array, it gives us a number of items in that array. So if I use here, instead of actually specifying a number, I can say names.length, and that's going to be equal to the number of items in our array, which just happens to be 7. Alright, so I can say as long as I is less than this length, which is the same as saying 7, then it's going to continue running. Okay, so let's comment that out and then uncomment this one and run it again. So then we see it just automatically grabs it, and then if we were to add another name to that list, it's going to automatically still loop through everything in that array without us having to change, to go in and manually say, okay, now there's 8 or now there's 9 or something like that. Okay, so then the next thing that we talked about, and let's go ahead and comment all this stuff out. Moving to a new topic, which we talked about events, and we said that anytime we do something in JavaScript, it's running an action on the page, and it's almost always based on a user interacting with that page. When a user clicks somewhere or does something, we might want JavaScript to change how the page is viewed or what content is visible on the page or update something, and so we use event listeners. Okay, we say whenever an event happens, a particular event happens on a page, we want a block of JavaScript to fire. Okay, and so we said there's a list of different events that you can pick from. The most common one that we're going to use as an example is click, and so we can and we don't just specify it on the entire page. We don't say whenever someone clicks anywhere on the page, or we could, but it's not really the best way to do it. We could say when someone clicks on a particular item on a page, then we want to execute some JavaScript. So the first thing we would do is go back to similar to what we were doing in the previous class, and actually select an item on the page, or an element in the DOM actually. So let's actually put a secondary header in here so we have something to look at, and then let's actually select the entire div by saying get element by ID, and we're saying that's result. Just remembered we actually forgot to grab to show how to put that array in there, but you should have that in your notes. Alright, so we've selected the get element by ID of result. We say okay, we're accessing that element, but instead of using a property, we're actually going to set something with it. So we're going to come in and say header dot add event listener, and that's a method that we can apply to it. And so this is saying that we're going to tell it two things. We're going to tell it a what kind of event that we want, and so in this case we're going to say it's the click event, and then we're going to specify a function that runs whenever that event happens, okay? And we're using a little bit different type of function than we've used before. We used to have ones that had names and we could call them by those names and reuse them over and over. But in this case, we're going to use what's called an anonymous function, okay? And it's basically a function that's going to be called as soon as this is handled, okay? Since there's no name for it, gets called as soon as it's asked for, or as soon as it's created, basically. And it's only created when there's an event that we're listening for. So when someone clicks, then this function is created and executed at the exact same time. And so inside those curly braces, just like a normal function, we can put code that we want to happen. Alright, so we might say alert success. And so that's just saying whenever someone clicks on inside the element that has an ID of result, we want it to pop up and say success. Okay, so let's run it. And then when we click on it, it pops up just like we want it to. Okay. So that's basically what event listeners are. We mentioned in class that there's plenty of references online where you can go and look and see what all the 100 or so different type of events are. It's not important to know what all of them are. It's just good to have to be familiar with what kinds of things are possible. And then once you actually need to do something in your code, you can just go look up and see what particular event's going to be best for what you're looking for. So we're trying to communicate exactly to communicate the principle of an event listener, and not so much, okay, go memorize all of these different types of events. Okay, so we'll look at one more event listener just as an example, just like we did in class, and one that's not quite so obvious, and that's the focus. Okay, and we're actually going to use console.log here so it doesn't get too annoying, but we can see what's going on. And we're just going to say, okay, whenever this event is called, we want to log something to the console. And alright, so but we don't necessarily do it on just a regular element. The focus is intended for form elements. Okay, so let's go create just a real quick form. We're going to go add all the different things that are needed. So I'm just going to say, okay, here's a form. We haven't set any attributes on it, but I just want to put an input in there. So we'll say input type text, has an ID of name and a name. Okay, so you can see it's created our input over there. So let's go ahead and say, okay, now we're selecting something with an ID of name, right, which we just set there. And so now when I run this, when I focus inside our input element, then it executes that, which is a good thing. We actually say, okay, it's making it, but it's not quite the same as, and maybe it'll make a little more sense if we use an alert. We run, you can see that it keeps popping up because technically I'm still focused inside of that inside the input element, and every time I call the alert, it's actually losing focus, and then we hit OK, the focus goes back, and so it's constantly running over and over. And you get into some cases like that with focus, and so you need to make sure that you know exactly what you're using focus for. Okay, there's also a key up event which says, let's run this again. So nothing fires, nothing happens in our console because it's just key up. But saying every time I type something, and it's not working. Let's actually send this back to the console so we can keep typing in between it running. So every time I type something in there, it fires inside that anonymous function every time I let go of the key. Okay, so anyway, there's a lot of different actions. These are just 3 different examples of different interactions that someone might make on a page that we can then use to execute some code. Alright, so we'll call this quits for today.